At 8:40 on the morning of the 24th of April, 1945, Ensign Philip Lundeberg was asleep in the stern of the destroyer escort USS Frederick C. 400 miles out in the empty North Atlantic. He was 21 years old. His ship had 9 minutes to live. The men he stood watch with, up forward on the bridge, had less. The Davis was 300 feet of steel and nearly 200 men. She was the outermost ship on a wall of warships, the first thing in the water between the open ocean and the coast of the United States. 46 American warships had been pulled out into the middle of nowhere for one reason. The US Navy believed a German submarine was coming through and that it was carrying a rocket meant for New York. That fear was what put Lundeberg out here. Not a battle, a shield. In January, Admiral Jonas Ingram had stood up in an East Coast port and told the country on the record that the Nazis might throw flying bombs at New York inside of 60 days. So the Navy strung a wall of ships across the ocean and ordered men like Lundeberg to hold it. At 8:40, the wall sprang a leak. One torpedo into the forward engine room. 9 minutes later, the Frederick C. Davis folded in half and went down, and 115 men went with her. She was the last American warship lost in the Atlantic, 2 weeks before the end of the war. They died holding the line against a weapon aimed at New York. And there was one thing none of them knew. Not Lundeberg in the water, not the admiral, not the men already dropping depth charges on the submarine that did it. Nobody could yet say whether that weapon had ever existed at all. It started with 2 men and a rubber raft. On a freezing night in late November 1944, a teenager hunting near Hancock Point, Maine, watched 2 figures walk up out of the surf in overcoats and city shoes, miles from anywhere. One was Erich Gimpel, a German intelligence officer. The other was William Colepaugh, an American who had changed sides. A U-boat had put them on that beach. Within 3 weeks, the FBI had them both. And under questioning, they talked. They talked about something they said was already in motion. U-boats. Rocket U-boats. Fitted to fire flying bombs at the cities of the American East Coast. First on the list, New York. Berlin had been saying it out loud too. That same winter, Germany's own armaments minister Albert Speer went on the radio and promised that New York would feel German vengeance weapons before the war was over. Whether the 2 spies on the beach actually knew anything or were trading rumor for leniency almost did not matter. The story landed on a navy that had every reason to take it seriously. The previous 3 years had taught them to expect exactly that. In 1942, U-boats appeared off the American coast and burned tankers within sight of the beaches at Miami and New York, while the country was still half asleep to the danger. In 1944, the Germans fitted their boats with the snorkel, a breathing tube that let a submarine hide underwater almost indefinitely, and a hunting fleet that had been winning suddenly watched its targets vanish again. Every time the Navy decided it finally understood the U-boat, the enemy moved the line. So when 2 prisoners began describing rockets aimed at New York, the men responsible for the American coast were not going to be the ones who guessed wrong a 3rd time. And the evidence kept pointing the same way. A new U-boat group forming up in occupied Norway. 6 long-range boats ordered west across 3,000 miles of ocean. Aerial photographs of odd shapes on their decks. Decoded signals about special missions. Read in the cold light of that fear, every piece said the same thing. The rockets were coming, and they were already at sea. So, the Navy answered the way you answer a threat to a city of 8 million people. It strung a wall across the open Atlantic. More than 40 warships, 4 small aircraft carriers. A barrier of steel a man could have walked for days without reaching the end of. 46 ships against a handful of submarines. And if you want to measure how seriously the country took it, the warning is not hard to find. Admiral Ingram's statement ran on the front page of Stars and Stripes on the 9th of January, 1945, under the headline Imminent Peril of V1, US Told. Flying bombs against New York, he said, within 30 to 60 days. By submarine, by surface ship, by long-range plane. An entire country had been told the war might be about to arrive on its own doorstep. And on the outer edge of that wall, the first ship anything coming from the east would have to get past, the Navy posted a destroyer escort called the Frederick C. Davis, Philip Lundeberg's ship. A wall is only ever as strong as the first man standing on it. The fear was real. The force was real. And there was still one question that none of it could answer. Not the ships, not the men, not the depth charges. Only cracking one of those U-boats open would settle it. Was there really a rocket inside? Or had the most powerful navy on Earth put to sea against a ghost? By the second week of April 1945, the wall was up. 2 lines of warships strung across the North Atlantic, escort carriers in the rear flying patrols around the clock, destroyer escorts spaced along the dark like fence posts. Somewhere to the east, 6 U-boats of a group the Germans called Seewolf were pushing west into it. The first one died on the 15th. You can follow it almost minute by minute because the destroyer escort Stanton kept her war diary to the clock. And that diary survives. At 23:45, her radar caught something at 3,500 yards. A few minutes after midnight, the frost joined her. They walked their hedgehog charges across the contact in the dark. At 01:14, the crews felt 2 heavy explosions come up through the hulls. At 0200, the frost lit the surface and opened fire on a submarine that had been forced up. At 0210, it slid under for the last time. U-1235 went to the bottom with every man aboard. And here was the part that mattered more than the kill. As the boat died, the sea heaved with a blast far bigger than one drowning submarine should make. To the sonar operators, with their headphones pressed to their ears, it sounded like the one thing they had been sent out to fear. A warhead, going off in the deep. Nobody could prove what it was, and nobody wanted to be the man who decided it was nothing. 30 hours later, on the 16th, the same 2 ships ran down U-880 in the dark and put her under the same way. Again, the huge secondary blast. Again, the question with no answer. Then a week of nothing but grey water and rising nerves. On the 22nd, far to the west off Nova Scotia, the Carter and the Neil A. Scott boxed in U-518 and sent her down with all hands. 3 boats gone in 8 days. And not one of them, when the wreckage floated up, carried anything but ordinary torpedoes. But a dead U-boat keeps her secrets on the seabed. The hunters could not yet know what they were killing. So the fear held. The line held. And on the 24th of April, the wall met the boat that would make all of them pay for it. The boat was U-546, and the man at her periscope was Captain Lieutenant Paul Just. A little after 8:30 that morning, he was lining up on one of the escort carriers the whole wall existed to protect, when the picket ship in his way caught him on sonar and swung around, straight toward him. The Frederick C. Davis, Philip Lundeberg's ship. After that, it came down to who fired first. The Davis came around hard to attack. Just certain the small ship was screening a carrier, decided it was him or her, and he was quicker. At 8:40, from about 650 yards off her port bow, he put 1 torpedo into her, into the forward engine room at frame 61. We know what happened next, almost second by second, because the ship's navigator lived to set it down for the Navy's own records 3 weeks later. The blast tore up through both sides of the hull at once and straight through the bridge. In Lundeberg's words, it blew the officer of the deck all the way off the flying bridge, way up in the air and over the front of the sound shack, down to number 2 gun. Most of the men on watch were gone in that first second. The captain, Lieutenant James Crosby, was among them. 9 minutes. That is how long the Davis had, and Lundeberg counted them. About 9 minutes, he remembered. The water had come up to the end of the deckhouse there, and it was necessary for us to go over the side. 9 minutes after the torpedo struck, the Frederick C. Davis folded in the middle like a closing book and went down. 115 of her roughly 200 men went with her. She was the last American warship sunk in the Atlantic in the entire war, 16 days before it ended. What is it worth to be asleep in the right compartment? Lundeberg and the men aft lived because steel and luck put them behind the blast. The men forward did not. The survivors went into water around 55 degrees, cold enough to pull the strength out of a man in minutes, and held onto rafts and onto each other until the other escorts could turn back for them. When the destroyer escort Hater pulled her load out, she brought up 66 men. 65 of them were still alive. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution that took 11 hours. U-546 had done the one thing certain to bring the whole pack down on her. She had killed in front of witnesses. By a little after noon, the escorts had her pinned underwater, and they would not leave. A depth charge run. Then silence. Then listen. Then another run. Just took his boat deep and ran silent and twisted through the water, and for most of the afternoon it very nearly worked. Then, near 10 minutes to 7 in the evening, a hedgehog pattern from the destroyer escort Flaherty finally broke something below. U-546 was hurt and she could not stay down. She came up into a ring of waiting guns, and here just did the last defiant thing left to him. Surfacing into hopeless odds, his crew put 2 torpedoes into the water at the Flaherty. Both missed. It was the last shot U-546 would ever fire. The escorts opened up with everything they had, and 7 minutes later, the submarine that had killed the Davis rolled over and went down. At 19:56 that evening, the word went out across the task unit. 33 German survivors pulled from the water, including, in the War Diary's own words, Lieutenant Paul Just, commanding officer of U-546. The man who had fired the morning's torpedo was alive, dripping on an American deck, a prisoner of the same Navy whose ship he had broken in half before breakfast. There is a grim arithmetic in that. He had taken 115 American lives at dawn. By nightfall, his own boat was on the bottom, and he was in a cell. The next morning, before first light, the destroyer escort Otter gathered the dead she had recovered from the Davis, and at 10 minutes to 6, she gave them to the sea. Then the ships turned west, and the active hunt was over. The 33 survivors of U-546 did not go to an ordinary prison camp. A day after the sinking, the destroyer escort Varian was peeled off the hunt and ran the prisoners ahead to Argentia in Newfoundland. From there, the most valuable of them, Paul Just and a handful of his officers and technical men, were sent south to a place that did not officially exist. A fenced compound on the Potomac outside Washington that the Army and Navy knew only by its mailing address. P.O. Box 1142, Fort Hunt, Virginia. Fort. They were brought there for one reason. The hunt had killed 5 U-boats and proved nothing, because dead boats do not talk. Just's men were the only people the United States had in its hands who might know whether the rockets were real. The war was still on. New York was still out there. The pressure to make them speak was enormous. What happened in those rooms did not surface for 60 years. It was not in the clean wartime record. It came out later, in survivor accounts and files that stayed sealed until the 2000s, and it is ugly. By those later accounts, Just and several of his crew were handled hard. Isolation, threats, beatings. Sessions built to break a man down rather than question him. The interrogators wanted rockets, launch platforms, target dates, the names of the boats already at sea. We should be honest about this part because the people who judged it most harshly afterward wore the same uniform as the men who did it. The Navy's own post-war reviewers looked back at the handling of the U-546 prisoners and called it a stain on a service that, almost everywhere else, had kept the rules. That matters. An institution that names its own worst day is a different thing from one that buries it. And here is the bitter center of all of it. The men being beaten for the secret of the rocket U-boats could not give it up, because there was no secret. Just had crossed the Atlantic with a hull full of ordinary torpedoes and nothing else. He had killed an American warship with one of them, and that was the whole of what he carried. They were interrogating a ghost out of men who had never seen it either. Before the proof came in, the hunt killed one more time, and this last one carried the strangest timing of all. By the first week of May, Germany was finished. Hitler was dead. The surrender was days, then hours away. But out in the Atlantic, the wall was still up, still listening, because orders move slower than history. On the night of the 5th of May, the destroyer escort Farquhar picked up a contact. U-881, one more boat from the same group, still pushing west toward a coast she would never reach. The Farquhar ran her down through the dark, and in the early hours of the 6th, with the German surrender only hours away, put her on the bottom with all hands. More than 50 men drowned in the last gasp of a war already lost. She was the 5th and final boat of Operation Teardrop. The proof itself came in quietly, the way proof usually does. Not in an interrogation room, but at sea after the shooting stopped. When Germany surrendered, the U-boats still out there were ordered to surface, fly a black flag, and give themselves up. 2 boats from that same Seewolf group, U-805 and U-858, did exactly that, and came in under American guns. Officers climbed down inside them and went through them compartment by compartment, hunting for the thing the entire spring had been about. Launch rails, rocket cradles, modified decks. What they found was torpedoes, mines, the ordinary deadly furniture of an ordinary submarine. Nothing else. There had been a project. That part was true. German engineers really had drawn up a way to do the exact thing America feared. A long, watertight steel container that a U-boat could tow across the ocean, stand on end, and use to fire a V-2 at a coastal city. On paper it was real, and on paper it was terrifying. But paper was very nearly all it ever became. The thing was never finished. No container was ever mated to a rocket. No U-boat ever put to sea with one. As the Allies overran the rocket works, the whole idea was abandoned, months before Operation Teardrop ever sent a ship to sea. After the war, the German commanders confirmed it without drama. Dönitz's own operations staff described the rocket U-boat for what it had been: a concept, a drawing, a what-if that never went to war. There are 2 ways to weigh what happened. The easy one is to call it a blunder. 46 warships, 5 killed submarines, and 115 dead American sailors, all spent against a weapon that had already ceased to exist. But that is the verdict of a man who already knows the ending. The Navy did not. It had a captured agent describing rockets, a public threat out of Berlin, 6 long-range boats steaming for the coast, and the hard memory of being surprised twice before. Given what they could actually see, the wall was not folly. It was the price of refusing to gamble with an American city. The tragedy is not that the Navy acted. The tragedy is that good men died doing their duty against a danger that, this time, turned out to be a shadow. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Anyone who has ever had to make a hard call on bad information knows the trap. You cannot afford to be wrong, so you prepare for the worst. Sometimes the worst never comes. And only afterward, only once it is safe, does everyone get to call it an overreaction. It was true off the Azores in 1945. It is true in every command post and every hospital and every house where somebody has to decide before they are allowed to know. Philip Lundeberg lived. He was one of the men the hater pulled out of that cold water. 21 years old, asleep in the stern when the torpedo hit, which was very nearly the only reason he was alive at all. And he spent the rest of his life refusing to let the others disappear. He went back to school, took a doctorate in history, and ended up somewhere the boy in the stern could never have pictured. A curator at the Smithsonian Institution, one of the country's keepers of its own naval past. The kid who survived the last American warship sunk in the Atlantic became one of the people responsible for remembering it. He did that work for decades. He died in 2019, 96 years old, still telling the story. Almost none of the detail you have heard tonight comes from the usual retellings. It is in a war diary kept to the minute on another ship that day. And in an interview, a 21-year-old gave 3 weeks after he was pulled out of the Atlantic. The kind of record that sits in a government archive for 80 years, waiting for someone to read it. We read it. The men who went down with the Frederick C were the crew of one small ship, doing one of the loneliest jobs of the whole war. And they were not the only ones out there. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Atlantic anti-submarine war, on the Davis herself, on the Hater, the Otter, the Flaherty, the Pillsbury, or the Varian. On the escort carriers Bogue and Core, or anywhere in the 10th Fleet's escort divisions, then their name belongs in this story too. If you carry one, leave it below. It costs nothing, and it keeps a man from disappearing. The rocket never came. New York was never in danger from a single thing those U-boats carried. But the fear was real. The wall of ships was real, and the men on the outer edge of it were as real as the cold water that took them. 9 minutes, off the Azores, 2 weeks before the end. 115 men, holding a line against a ghost. They were never going to make the history books. Now at least they are somewhere,